the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of the Fact Series, in which we discuss international political matters every week. This is Foad Mahdavi, and in this episode, I have the honor of being the host of Max Parry, a journalist and writer from the United States. We are here to discuss the American Police Brutality. Thank you for joining us, Max, and good to be with you. For the first strike, I'd like to ask, compared to other countries, the United States has the highest homicide rate by police. Are there any justification for this behavior against the American people?
Well, of course not. Of course, that's largely has to do with the fact that the U.S. police force is highly militarized. And, there's also significant differences between the U.S. police force versus, say, many European countries or Canada, in terms of carrying concealed weapons, and the way that they police is also vastly different. And that's because of especially the 1994 crime bill wrote in that, this massive overhaul of the domestic police state, to where even police forces in very small towns have SWAT teams now. Just everything. If you look at, not only does the United States have such huge crime rates and gun rates involving gun violence, it's no wonder that it also has the highest prison population. But then it also has the unique trait of all cops carrying guns. So I think it's a systematic problem. It's self-perpetuating. So of course, no, there's no justification for it, but there's a great need for criminal justice reform in the United States, and it's become such a problem that even now the party that was formerly, their whole central slogan was being tough on crime. Even Republicans are now starting to talk about not about lowering the incarceration rate, where people in record numbers were thrown in prison for trivial offenses, nonviolent drug offenses, for example. Even the Republicans are starting to talk about lowering the incarceration rate. The Hillary Clinton, when she ran in 2016, as far as the Democrats go, when she ran in 2016, even she had to apologize for her husband's crime bill. It was major backlash because it contributed so much to the rate at which Black Americans were being locked up in record numbers. So as far as police brutality goes, again, I would say it's entirely, it's always talked about in an isolated manner. It's never talked about as being connected to the way the U.S. projects political power abroad. It's never talked about in connection with other issues which is clearly related. The United States is a terrified country. It solves everything with violence. And so that's the case abroad and domestically. So until the conversation is not held in such a narrow way, I don't think it's really going to be substantive enough to solve the issue. It has to be understood in connection with the the way that the U.S. Is an empire that, Malcolm X said the chickens are coming home to roost when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And when he said that, he was referring to how, the United States had, through imperialism, had tried to assassinate Fidel Castro after the Cuban Revolution, and had waged the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. And so he said the chickens were coming home to roost. And I think that that's the case with U.S. violence, through imperialism. It's domestic police state violence is an example of that. I think that statement rings true today. But no, of course it's not justified. But I think that really the two major parties have just really harmed the quality of the conversation that needs to be had to really understand the issue. They've commandeered it and just reduced it to this two-party culture wars that does not do the issue justice at all.
Actually, among those killed by American police, there is a very high and asymmetric percentage of blacks in comparison to whites. Is it because of the same racist system, or is the crime rate higher among Black Americans?
Well, it's extremely complicated. I mean, the crime rate is higher, but that is because of, there's a, the way that the law enforcement, the law is enforced against Black people is different. For example, during the crack epidemic, the way that sentencing was done towards offenders who used crack cocaine versus regular cocaine, which was if a white person was caught with cocaine versus a Black person caught with crack cocaine, their differences in their sentencing was vast. And then in the 90s you had the introduction of mandatory minimum sentencing, where judges were no longer allowed to judge cases on their individual merit. And if someone had committed a certain crime, no matter what the individual or the particulars were of that case, they would have to sentence them to a minimum of 5 or 10 years or whatever it is. And then you also had the introduction of the 3 strikes law, where if you commit 3 felonies, no matter what they are, you go to prison for life. So, that's why you've seen over the last several decades, the U.S. prison population just grow astronomically. So again, it is because of racism and the way that the law is enforced, and the way, while law enforcement is being militarized, there, is a serious lack of a social safety net in the United States. The amount of money put into education and infrastructure and, things that help communities has been cut, while the amount poured into law enforcement and militarizing the U.S. police force has increased. So, of course, you're going to see, it's not an adequate solution to the problem. So, and also as far as the crime rate with the black community goes, when slavery was abolished, there was a clause in the 13th Amendment that you know, having a slave economy was illegal unless one had committed a crime. And so the need to criminalize black people began almost instantly after slavery was abolished. And, after that, you had the rise of convict leasing, chain gangs. And, when the civil rights movement exploded, and in the a half a century later, the government's response was to, blame the rising crime rate, which was really the rising crime rate in the 50s was because of, the country's industrialized. The population growth itself had increased. It wasn't just something happening on its own. And so, there's a overall systemic racism. So as far as the issue of crime goes, the U.S. government's solution is something that's actually perpetuated it rather than solved it by any means.
Actually, in America, it is very rare for the American police to reprimand it or prosecute it. This has exacerbated police violence in the United States. How do you assess this supportive approach by the U.S. government in favor of police?
Well, I think in the last couple of years, we actually have started to see a slight shift in that. We've seen some cases where obviously it is true that generally speaking, in the past especially, it was very, very rare for law enforcement when they commit abuses to face criminal charges. But I think that the backlash, has gotten so strong, and also, the fact that, look at this recent case. How did it happen? It's only because innocent bystanders recorded it, and the power of social media, it went viral, and it's a start that these 4 cops were fired. We'll have to wait and see whether they actually get charged with any crime like they should be in Minneapolis. But I do think there's started to be, this is becoming such a central issue, where these just routine atrocities are committed on camera against black men. I think that it's become such a central issue that, and when you have spontaneous protests that turn into riots after, law enforcement uses stun grenades and rubber bullets, it's becoming such a tumultuous issue. I think that hopefully you're going to start to see a trend where U.S. law enforcement do suffer consequences when they break the law. But, it's really complicated because, on the other hand, it's been well documented even by the FBI that white supremacist groups, for example, have infiltrated law enforcement. We saw with this case in Georgia, where the 2 vigilantes who killed Ahmaud Arbery, one of them was a former private investigator that was used by local police. So, there's a lot of overlap, I think, not everywhere, but, to a certain extent between white supremacist groups and law enforcement. And you know, law enforcement attracts certain types of personalities, and you know, so the problem runs really deep. But unfortunately, you know, even though we have started to see some officers get charged when they commit abuses, we've also seen like what happened in 2015 when Obama signed the Blue Alert law after there were 2 police officers were assassinated in Brooklyn by a vigilante, sort of the opposite kind. And that was used as an excuse to, you know, ram through a law where, you know, when a police officer has been killed or is under threat, they, you know, send out a GPS alert system to everyone's phone, you know, that there's a suspect on the loose, you know, which is unprecedented. So at the same time, you know, certain gains are made. There's also pushback against that, where you have laws signed that do more to give police immunity and protect law enforcement. So it's an ongoing struggle. Well, no question, it's an extreme abuse of power. I mean, actually, the video that went viral almost makes it look less bad than it actually was, because there have been all videos of alternate angles released, and where there are actually 3 other police officers next to Derek Chauvin. What an appropriate name, by the way, Chauvin, chauvinist. There were actually 3 other police officers next to him behind the car, pinning down the same man who was not resisting arrest by, you know, there's footage, CCTV footage that shows his initial apprehension, and he's not resisting arrest. I mean, it's just totally uncalled for. You know, it's inexplicable why they, you know, he was clearly subdued, why they wouldn't pick him up and put him in the police car. Reportedly, he was claustrophobic, and didn't want to be inside the car. But so, you know, just the you know, the cutting off of his air supply, it's eerily reminiscent, like everybody's saying, of the Eric Garner case a few years ago, where, you know, it's just multiple officers subduing one person for an utterly petty offense. I mean, you know, using a forged, allegedly a forged bill or check. I mean, it's a nonviolent crime. It's just the response is just absolutely disproportionate. And, you know, most disturbing about it is just the sort of casual nature with which it was carried out. I mean, and, you know, the fact that this case and also the Ahmaud Arbery case, there are only possible legal repercussions because of the recording by bystanders. In the Arbery case, one of which was possibly involved. You know, the Arbery case, I think, you know, might have been some sort of initiation into like a white supremacist organization or something, because, you know, there's one person filming behind in the car, and then, you know, the son, who I think seems sort of like might have had some sort of mental health issues, you know, with the father, and it almost seemed like an initiation where the father was getting the son to carry out some sort of crime to be as like a rite of passage into a white supremacist organization. But that's just speculation on my part. Yeah. As far as the this recent shooting in Minneapolis, you know, even Trump tweeted that he was having the FBI investigated. I mean, no, it's just completely indefensible. Even the most hawkish, supporters of U.S. police, I don't think can defend this one. It's just so bad.
How do you see the recent murder of George Floyd by the U.S. police, and what was the feedback? What was the actual reaction of the American people to this crime?
Well, we've seen spontaneous protests erupt in Minneapolis, and now it's spreading to other cities. We've seen this in the past with, the Michael Brown case, and in Ferguson and Baltimore. I think this is probably another instance of where these protests are going to spread. But they were transformed into riots. I think it's important to say, because of the brutal police response. They began as peaceful demonstrations. They only became rioting and what some people are describing as looting after, the totally unnecessary deployment of rubber bullets and tear gas against unarmed demonstrators in the middle of a global pandemic. I mean, these people are wearing masks. I don't understand what they expect just by, obviously it's a nice start that the 4 officers were fired, but they haven't been charged with any crime yet. The numerous communities across the United States where we just see this happen time and time again, it's an expression of political powerlessness, where people are having to resort to expressing outrage in the most primal way possible. But hopefully something constructive will come out of it, and that is some kind of legislation or something where not only it's not enough that just that these officers are charged, but there needs to be a real systemic change regarding policing in the United States. Otherwise, this is just going to keep happening. Blaming the individual officers for what happened, which they obviously should be held accountable, but that's not enough. Otherwise, it's just like with the Abu Ghraib prison abuses. The individual soldiers were eventually faced legal repercussions, but the leaders that oversaw them, that ignored the torture and abuses, they got off scot-free. And so, that's why you're still going to see war crimes and other abuses by the U.S. military abroad. The same thing with, unless you really get to the root of the issue, it's just going to keep happening.
At the end, if you would like to add something more, I'm all ears.
Sure. Yeah. I would just say that, the way that this issue is discussed in the United States, the principal task of the 2 major political parties in the U.S. is to divide the working class on cultural issues. And one of them in recent decades has been the issue of police brutality and racism in the United States. And, the conversation is framed in this very narrow way. And I think the job of the media and journalists is to, real independent, I'm not talking about your network, but, real corporate media, just like the 2 parties, is also preoccupied with, keeping the discussion to this narrow, very limited, short-sighted and myopic understanding of where history, there's no context to anything. Everything is looked at, not in a broader understanding. And so I think that the job of the media, real independent journalists like ourselves, is to push through the full context of issues like this, because the public cannot rely on the media, which is just extensions of the two major political parties, and they're both embedded in the problem. So I think that's our principal task as journalists, is trying to expand the acceptable parameters of the conversation.
Thanks for joining us again, Max, and good to see you here in this episode of the Fact Series, and God bless you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Anytime. I appreciate it.
Dear audience, it was another talk with Max Parry, journalist and writer from the United States, about American police brutality. Thanks for watching, and catch you later.